This is U.S. Immigration Attorney Sharifa Tharpe. I'm here live to take your U.S. immigration related questions. Go ahead and put your questions in the comments now so that I can get to your questions as soon as I'm finished with the topic that I am here to talk about. So, I want to talk to you about going from the 2 year green card to the 10-year green card and what it's like going through the interview. Now, right now, for whenever you're going from 2 year to the 10 year, and if you're preparing to apply for that, you may not have to do the interview. They have released policy guidelines stating that if the officer reviews your application and they don't have any questions about the bona fides of your marriage, or they have no further questions for you, they can easily go ahead and just send you your green card in the mail. So, this is a reminder that you don't necessarily have to do the interview. If you prepare a solid application, a thoughtful, thorough, solid application, you can avoid the interview altogether. But there are some instances where the officer will have questions. And because of that, they go ahead and still schedule an interview. Right now, the going from the 2 year green card to the 10-year green card is taking about 2 years, just because it's backed up. It's not supposed to take that long, but it is because things are backed up right now. But that is not to say that you will face a 2 year processing time, but that's the average time I'm seeing right now. Now, once you're called in for an interview, what should you expect? So the officer, when they're taking you to this interview, they have two questions that they want to answer here. And it depends on the situation. Let me first go backwards and say, when you're going from a 2 year to a 10 year, there are two ways that you are going to apply for this. The first is you're applying for the 10 year, going from the 2 year to the 10 year, jointly with your spouse. That means you're with your spouse, everything is good. Now, the immigration service, they're just checking up on you again to make sure that your marriage is valid. And if it's valid, then valid, bona fide, it's real, then you're going to get that 10-year green card. However, there are, it's life. Marriages sometimes they don't last. And the immigration service has planned for situations like that. Under the law, you are still able to apply for the 10 year, going from the 2 year, out your spouse. But you have to make sure you carefully approach this situation, because you want to make sure that you comply with the requirements of the law, so you have a higher chance of being approved, that you don't bump into any complications. And the number one complication I see with this type of application is you started out great with your spouse. You may have applied for jointly with your spouse, but then while you're waiting, because now it's taking a whole 2 years on average for this process to go through. So while you're waiting, you and your spouse break up. You're either separated or you straight up get divorced. And now you find yourself alone in the process. What do you do then? You must make sure that you formally submit a waiver to apply on your own. And there are four types of waivers, three common waivers. So the first is if you got divorced, you can show your final divorce decree. You're going to apply for a waiver based on termination of the marriage, but you also at the same time still have to prove that your marriage was bona fide. The second is you don't necessarily have to be separated from your spouse, but if you're separated, not necessarily divorced, or you are divorced, but you also experience mistreatment or extreme cruelty or abuse, then you can apply to have the conditions removed on your own without involving that spouse under a VAWA provision. And this will allow you to then show that you've been mistreated. And this can include your statement, by the way. It does not have to be, for example, a police report or medical report showing any injuries, because abuse does not just cover, it doesn't just cover physical abuse, but it also covers emotional abuse. It also covers financial abuse. It also covers verbal abuse. So keep that in mind, that if you're being mistreated, you can apply for a waiver. If you're not officially divorced yet, you can still apply for a waiver based on the mistreatment. Then the third is based on extreme hardship. Now, under extreme hardship, you don't necessarily have to show that you're married. You don't even have to show the bona fides of the marriage, but you do have to show that you're going to experience extreme hardship more than the usual, due to circumstances that arose in the past 2 years or the past few years, that you got your green card. So the 2 years after you got your green card, the complication arose or some circumstance arose that now will make it very hard to move forward. It will present extreme hardships if you have to go back to your country. So that is in, and those are the ways to approach it. So you're either applying jointly or you're applying on your own. If you're applying jointly, you have to show that you continue to be married and you're living within a bona fide marriage. The others, waivers, most of those waivers, to apply on your own, will require you to show that your marriage was real. My advice here is that if you see that your marriage is falling apart, whether you're separated or not, make sure you document everything. Make sure you have documents to show that you were with your spouse and it was bona fide. It just didn't work out. Because one of the main challenges that I see with these types of applications, especially when you're applying on your own, is the lack of documentation, the lack of showing, because the main thing that the officer really is looking out for is, was this a real marriage? And if it's not looking like a real marriage to the officer based on the lack of evidence that you've provided, you will be. So before, make sure, even if you're married now, all is well with your spouse, take the time to document everything. Document your travels together, document the properties you bought together, document the benefits that you share together, document your current, make sure you have a safe place to keep those documents. Make sure you're accessing those documents. Make sure you have your bank statements, your joint bank statements lined up. Make sure that if I know this tax, it all depends on what your tax liabilities would be and what the tax consequences will be for you and your spouse. Some spouses, just depending on their circumstances, can't necessarily apply for taxes together. But if you can, make sure you're filing your taxes and you're keeping them, because you want to be prepared. You want to give yourself the best chance. And even if your marriage falls apart, you still want to be able to have the evidence to show your marriage is real. So another tip here is, once you and your spouse, you break up, don't go throwing pictures out, don't go throwing documents out the door, because now you want to sweep your marriage under the rug and you want it behind you. The way you're going to get this bad marriage behind you is to make sure you get your 10-year green card, that you're not left out in the cold or left without proving status. So now let's get back to the interview here. Now that I've explained to you what the 2-year going to the 10-year green card is, it's called removal of conditions. We apply using the I-751 form. You can either apply jointly or by yourself if you can't apply with your spouse. Another thing is, if your spouse has passed away, you can also show that your marriage was terminated through the death of your spouse, as well as still showing the bona fides of your marriage, to obtain the 10-year green card. Now, they recently did announce that they were aiming to waive the interviews, but whenever you have situations where you were applying jointly with your spouse, then you had to change over to a process where you're applying on your own. The officer may have some questions, and or even if you're filing jointly with your spouse, if they have any questions about that, they're going to schedule this interview. What should you be preparing for in that interview? Now, the focus of the officer is to determine whether you enter this marriage in good faith. That's one of the main things that the officer is looking at. Did you enter this marriage in good faith? So make sure that whether you're with your spouse or you're not with your spouse, and this is what I do, I help my clients with, and we recently just got a victory on August 31st. I went to the interview with my client on August 30th, and we recently got the approval the next day because I prepared my client thoroughly for what to expect. So when she went into this interview, she was not she was prepared, she was confident, she understood why the officer was asking those questions, and she understood the right ways to answer the questions so that the officer clearly understood that she qualified here. So make sure that you understand the reason you're going into the interview. The reason is the officer wants to understand whether your marriage was real, whether you're going in with your spouse or not. The interview can be very similar to your so the interview can be very similar to your marriage-based interview that you went to with your spouse previously. So they may separate you, they may not, but they're going to ask you questions to verify whether the both of you are still on the same page. Do the both of you have the same memory of how you met? What have the both of you been doing since you've been married? Have you filed any new tax returns? Have you saved up some money together in a joint bank account? Have you bought a car? Have you had kids? These will be questions very important to make evidence at the forefront, because you can avoid the officer having to schedule the interview to ask questions. Now, the other thing here is make sure that you can address if you're going in because of a waiver, because your spouse mistreated you, because you got divorced. You need to be able to clearly explain to the officer what transpired in the 2 years, or the years since, in the past years since you've gotten your green card, what transpired to now lead you to have to apply on your own. And it's important to understand the requirements for the waivers, because there are two questions now the officer is going to ask. Say in the case you've been mistreated and you're applying for a waiver based on the mistreatment, the officer is going to be asking two questions. Now, they're going to ask you a ton of questions to get to the answer for these two questions. And it is your marriage real? And is what happened to you credible? And is it credible, meaning is it believable? And does it qualify as extreme cruelty or abuse? So the officer is going to evaluate those two questions, but they're going to ask you a number of questions to get to the answer there. So they're going to ask you questions about your marriage, questions about how did you meet, in specific questions about the addresses you live together, specific questions about what happened, what were the specific circumstances that occurred that led to you being mistreated or abused. Um, Usually, when we are preparing these types of waivers, we are very detailed to present to the officer exactly what happened, instances of mistreatment, instances of abuse. So we don't just say in general, um, my client was abused. We state those reasons. And in some cases, we do get our clients to even get their therapy if they already have a therapist, because some of my clients go through a lot of trauma related to the marriage, so they already have their therapist. So we either get the therapist to also explain clearly why the client is going through why what they went through is mistreatment, especially when it comes to verbal and emotional abuse. And then if the client doesn't have a therapist, but we want to make sure that it's clear to the officer why this falls within extreme cruelty or mistreatment or abuse. We then also have our clients do an evaluation, and it's usually a VAWA evaluation that's done by a therapist, who the therapist is in a much better position to be able to explain to the officer in clear terms why what happened to my client is abuse and the specific effects it had on my client. So going into the interview is also important for you to be able to clearly explain to the officer what transpired and why this is amounts to extreme cruelty for you or abuse. It's really easy to explain to the officer, maybe if you were hit, you were physically assaulted, why that is abuse. But then when it comes on to the emotional abuse, verbal abuse, extreme cruelty, you want to make sure that you can state the instances of the abuse so that the officer can understand in clear terms, because people view abuse differently, and sometimes a part of my representation is to also educate whoever is reviewing the application, to help them to understand why what happened is abuse. So, for example, there may be cultural differences or cultural differences between the spouses, and maybe the abusive spouse used the client's culture against them. Maybe they knew that there was something that may not be offensive, say in the United States, but it's offensive in their culture, and so they harped on that specific culturally offensive thing towards my client. That can be considered as extreme cruelty and emotional abuse. Because they know they're not respecting the client's culture and they're offending them. They're aiming to intentionally offend them. So that's an example of where we have to in presenting the case to the officer, we do have to educate the officer about the background of our client and why the effect on the client amounts to extreme cruelty or emotional abuse. So going into the interview, I prepare my clients to these the particular document on hand. So it's very important to make sure you carry a copy of your application of exactly what you took in. Because if there's any questions the officer has, and you already sent that document in, you can point that out to the officer. And sometimes the officer wants to get a copy again to look at right on the spot. And that can be a game changer, because if maybe you knew you sent it in, but the officer says they didn't receive it, that could mean that the officer can make a decision without that document, and it can mean that they can go ahead and deny it. But had you had that document, it would have changed their opinion or their decision. So don't take that risk. Make sure that you have your application, a copy of your application. Bring updated evidence. Because the officer also wants to see what have you been doing since you submitted the application. That can also show that you continue a bona fide marriage, or it can show additional evidence that can convince the officer that you meet the requirements to go from the 2-year to the 10-year. So make sure, bring your original documents. Make sure you carry your birth certificate. Make sure you carry your original birth certificate. Make sure you have your passport. Make sure you have your identification, so your ID. If you're with your spouse, make sure that both of you have your IDs, and be careful about your address. If you are living at the same address, but you haven't changed your address on your driver's license, make sure you've done that so you both have the same addresses at the addresses you live, because if not, that can be distracting for the officer, and it can make them determine that you're not living together when you really are. So don't make sure your license is up to date. Make sure that you put, wherever you're living, make sure you put that address on your driver's license going into the interview. Now, make sure that you have, if you're divorced, your original divorce decree. Yes, I know you may have submitted the copy of your divorce decree, but the officer may want to touch that certificate, the divorce decree, to make sure that it's authentic. Sometimes they like to see original documents just to make sure that everything is authentic and real. So make sure you have those original documents with you, and then bring a copy in case the officer wants to keep a copy for themselves. Make sure you take pictures. That's why I say hold off on burning those pictures. If you're broken up or if you're separated from your spouse, hold off on deleting those pictures. Hold off on burning them. Make sure you still keep them maybe somewhere hidden so you don't have to see them all the time. But the officer is going to want to see the pictures. Can also help you. I like to refer to pictures as a cherry on top. The pictures will not get you approved. It will not, necessarily get you denied, but it's like a cherry on top, right? If the officer, on top of all the evidence you've provided, you can show pictures of the both of you together during better times, or if you're still together, of the special moments you've shared, that can seal the deal. That can seal the deal to convince the officer that, okay, you entered a marriage in good faith, and they will feel comfortable with going ahead and approving your application. One other thing you're going to hear me say is just make sure you get representation. Representation is key because, for example, I just went into this interview with my client, and it was not an easy interview. I saw somebody comment a video where I was sharing the victory that, oh, this is easy. Of course, they would have gotten approved. Well, no. This is a big mistake that a lot of people make. Is like they just think this is going to be so easy, especially in cases where you're married and you think, we're married. How hard could this be? And you'd be so surprised. I recently represented a couple who I represented them when they were getting the green card. So from the start, I represented this couple. So I knew them, and I made the case for them the first time, and then it was time for them to remove the condition to go from the 2-year to the 10-year. They went ahead and did it on their own this time because they were thinking, how hard could this be? We went through all of that. We got through. How hard could we continue to love each other, be a loving couple, live together, do everything? How hard could this be? Well, they were ready to deny the couple, which is outrageous. but they had to come right back to me, and I assisted them to get, instead of denial, instead of an interview, because they were just going to go ahead and deny them without an interview, because the evidence was just the evidence was not presented properly. And when we stepped in and we responded to them, they went ahead and approved them, sent the green card in the mail without scheduling an interview this time. You may think it's going to be easy, but don't step into this process naively, because a misstep here can mean we're just a long, drawn out process here. So make sure you get representation. It makes a difference. And a client that I went into the interview with just this past week, she was so grateful that I was there, and I was grateful that I was there with my client, because a lot of the questions that came up were legal questions that I had sure I officer, because my client wasn't. She understood that she what was happening to her was not fair to her, but she did not fully understand how to explain this in the legal terms that the officer would understand. And so with my presence there, I was able to do that for my client, and she got through, and I'm so happy about that. All right, so now I'm going to answer questions now that I've given you this gem today. So go ahead, put those questions in the comments, and I will answer your questions. I'm going to scroll through right now. Thank you, Mercedes. All right. How do I remove a joint sponsor that I don't have all required docs, and how long will it take? So now you've reached a level of complexity here. I don't know why you'd want to remove them if they're not cooperating, but you need to get legal advice, because I need to understand what's going on here. What's required? Are they not cooperating now? And it might be a matter of, if they're not meeting the requirements, and you've now seen that in a request for evidence, you might have to make sure you can comply with that by finding someone else, and then making the statement to them that you need that sponsor removed, and you now have another joint sponsor that's stepping in. But I'm not your lawyer, and I don't know what's going on in your case, so I wouldn't be able to advise you on that. Make sure you get legal advice. Schedule that consultation. Go to the link in the profile. You'll see a button that says schedule your own appointment. Schedule your appointment there. And my schedule is filling up, so make sure that you get on it quickly so I can assist you quickly. When you file based on marriage with a minor, are they processing the adult before the child, because the parent receives AAD and SSC card, and the child's own still saying case has been, so they process them separately. So I don't know if your spouse is a citizen or a resident, but when you're applying for adjustment of status, they usually review them separately. Ken said something about people coming from. Okay, so I think you're referring to people coming from coming across the border from Mexico. Well, there's a lot going on there. The latest that I have seen in regards to the border is that, the government, they're now sending out emails to those who were paroled. You may have been paroled coming through the border, that you're able to apply. You may qualify for a work permit. And so they sent out reminders to certain immigrants to make sure that they apply for the work permit. And they're starting a campaign to do that. But other than that, there's just a lot going on now with the border situation. Um, how long to get the work permit after applying for VAWA? So you're looking at around, I say 6 months to 12 months. The most I've seen is about 12 months, the maximum. Uh, all right. Good afternoon. Question is about adopted child. Is it possible to file for a child that is already adopted? It's possible, but there are very specific requirements. So, there is a requirement that you have to live with a child. You have to have physical and legal custody of the child for 2 years. And if the child is outside of the United States, you have to make plans to do that. And then there's also no, it's different based on what kind of country. You have Hague countries and non-Hague countries. And so the way that you adopt a child is going to depend on what kind of country it is. But then, they do have certain rules. It's not just a matter of applying for the child, but you have to make sure that you can show that you've had custody of the child, um, full and physical and legal custody of the child. You have to adopt them before the age of 16, and then apply for the I-130 petition. My husband and I dated and married within a span of 7 months from meeting. It makes me nervous how quickly we did it, but it is completely bona fide. Should I have reason to be worried? If it's completely bona fide, I would not be worried. Just focus on gathering the right evidence to show that you both are living as a married couple. J1 waiver been over a year now. Could it be something is wrong? No. So it could just be backed up. Everything is backed up, and so I would not necessarily panic, but always call if you have concerns. Call, check in. That they haven't asked you for anything additional. When we use a lawyer to file paperwork, does the USCIS related mail go to our home address or does it go to the lawyer's address? It's going to depend on what you put on the G28. There are boxes. So the G28 is the form that you use to show that you have an attorney. So the attorney uses that form to get authority to access the case and be able to communicate with the USCIS. And there are boxes there that allow you to opt for the attorney to receive your original documents. With VAWA, for example, our address is always a safe address for our clients. With T visas, it's the same thing. But the client can also opt to get it at their address as long as it's a safe address for them to receive it. So the last 60 days, didn't hear from them. Is it okay for me to reach out to the embassy in Jamaica to find out what is happening? Yes, so they do have emails, specific emails for the embassy where you can write in, just follow the instructions so that your email gets to the right place. But if just be careful about what kind of communication you're having with them. You want to make sure that you get legal advice before you take on anything on your own, just to make sure whatever you're trying to communicate with them is a good idea. How soon after marriage can a person apply for a waiver for the 212E home residency rule waiver? How long does the waiver take? So there's no timeline. So if you could have even applied for this before marriage. You can apply for it after marriage. So there's no deadline or no regulation saying when you can apply for it. All right, I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to go ahead and head out. Thanks again for your time. No, we've been having a lot of good news coming in, and we just got an I-130 petition approved, and it looks like it's going to be the entire green card process is going to be approved without the interest and that has been happening. So this is the second case in 1 month where we've received such good news. And so I want to talk about that tomorrow. I'm just going to talk about ways you can tell that they're possibly going to waive that interview, how to make sure that you can move that process along faster, especially in the marriage-based cases. So join me tomorrow. I usually come on at around lunchtime. So between 12 and 1, I come on to talk to you and give picks and information. So I'm really trying to stick to that to make sure I can touch base with you. So tomorrow I'm planning to come on and just talk about how to tell whether they're going to waive the interview and how to increase your chances to move things along faster, to make sure that they do waive the interview and that you do green card within short order of them, of you getting the hint that they're going to waive that interview. So let's talk tomorrow. Thanks for your questions. I'll see you tomorrow. If you want to get in touch, you want to schedule an appointment, go to the link in the profile, click on schedule your own appointment, and you'll be able to schedule your own appointment, or you can call the office. The number is on the bottom of the screen on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. And the number is on all of my videos on Instagram. So go ahead and those videos out and you'll see the number. Give me a call and let's talk. All right. Have a good one. Bye-bye.